y el Centro de Estudios Filosóficos Eugenio Pucciarelli de esta academia. El CEF, como le llamamos, es un centro predilecto dentro. El CEF es un centro predilecto dentro de la academia. Yo no sé si ustedes saben mucho de esta academia, pero es una academia multidisciplinaria que tiene 6 centros, que son de derecho privado, estudios del imaginario, ciencias económicas, ciencias forenses, tecnologías inteligentes y de estudios filosóficos. El CEF es el que tiene la trayectoria más larga de más de 50 años y dentro del CEF la sección de fenomenología y hermenéutica cuenta con 30 investigadores y becarios del CONICET, con lo cual es una destacada actividades de excelencia que se desarrollan en este centro. Este año los convoca un tema especialmente sugerente, figuras de la distancia. La noción de la distancia es abordada desde la fenomenología acontecial, no solo desde la vista, por lo que yo veo del programa, ¿no?, de Marion, sino también en relación con otros interlocutores contemporáneos como Levinas, Chrétien y Richir. Se trata de un horizonte de reflexión que conecta teología, política, ética, filosofía, con lo cual es un tema muy directo también a esta academia, en el cual tratamos de que las conferencias tengan distintos puntos de las distintas ciencias. Quiero destacar la riqueza institucional que hace posible estas jornadas. Contamos con la participación de colegas de la Universidad de Buenos Aires, la Universidad Nacional de Mar del Plata, Universidad Nacional de San Martín, Universidad Nacional del Nordeste y, por supuesto, la Universidad del Salvador. La diversidad de procedencias es un testimonio de la vitalidad de la fenomenología en Argentina y la importancia de seguir siempre tejiendo redes en el conocimiento. De manera muy especial, damos la bienvenida a nuestros invitados extranjeros. Stephen Lewis, de la Universidad Franciscana de Steubenville, Jeffrey Koski, Thomas Carlson y Robin Horner de la Universidad de Australia. Su presencia nos honra y abre un aspecto de intercambio fecundo en contexto de distintas sociedades y distintas tradiciones. Esto enriquece el trabajo filosófico. Estas jornadas son una ocasión para el estudio riguroso, pero también para la amistad intelectual. Por ello, con espíritu de gratitud y entusiasmo, declaro inauguradas estas jornadas y los invito a vivirlas como una oportunidad de búsqueda compartida, búsqueda de nuevas formas de pensar la cercanía, la comunidad, el don, la ciencia, la filosofía y, por qué no, la vida. Así que bienvenidos y disfruten las jornadas.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias, Damasia, por tus elocuentes palabras. Es para mí un honor y un placer inaugurar estas quintas jornadas en torno a la obra de Jean-Luc Marion. Ya es su quinta edición, hace 10 años que hicimos las primeras con muchos de los compañeros, colegas, compañeras que se encuentran aquí presentes y que me da mucha alegría que estén aquí en estas quintas jornadas, de las que bueno, participaron importantes especialistas a lo largo de esos 10 años, algunos de ellos verdaderos pioneros de los estudios marionianos en Latinoamérica. Me gustaría mencionar a Juan Carlos Escanone y a Carlos Enrique Restrepo. Ambos, bueno, han fallecido y han sido, yo diría, los dos grandes pioneros de los estudios de la obra de Marion en Latinoamérica, ¿no? En esta, bueno, y me gustaría también mencionar a algunos de estos expertos y expertas reconocidos internacionalmente que han participado de estas jornadas. Los voy a mencionar rápidamente. Javier Basas Vila, Brian Becker, Sylvain Camilleri, Carla Canulo, bueno, Thomas Carlson aquí presente, Krina Geschwander, Steven Lewis, también aquí presente, José Daniel López, Patricio Mena, César Moreno, Chiara Paván, Francesca Perusotti, Eric Pommier, Estefano Santacilia, Pascal Tabé, Estefan Vinoló, Roberto Walton, que además nos honra con su presencia aquí en el Zoom y va a participar también muy generosamente de estas quintas jornadas. Bueno, y muchos otros que nos han honrado con su presencia y enriquecido con sus aportes. Quiero agradecer especialmente a la Academia Nacional de Ciencias de Buenos Aires, a su presidenta, la doctora Damasia Becú, y al apoyo que nos ha dado a través de los años. Nuevamente lo quiero nombrar al profesor, al doctor Roberto Walton, que fue el director del Centro de Estudios Filosóficos, que ahora dirige el profesor doctor Luis Rabanaque, y ambos siempre nos han dado su apoyo y con entusiasmo y con generosidad, así que estamos muy agradecidos al Centro de Estudios Filosóficos, del que participamos y donde tenemos esta subsección de fenomenología acontecial dedicada especialmente a lo que llamamos, to what we call the eventual phenomenology, which it's a way to speak about, es una manera de tratar de englobar the work of the different phenomenologists, like Marion or Levinas or Chrétien, como Marion, Levinas y Chrétien. Sí, no es necesario traducir eso. Eh, bueno, y por supuesto agradecer especialmente a quienes han muy generosamente aceptado la invitación y han viajado desde muy lejos para participar de estas quintas jornadas. Thomas Carlson, Stephen Lewis y Jeffrey Koski desde Estados Unidos y Robin Horner desde Australia y Guille Salinas y los invitados que también vienen de la Argentina, de otras partes de la Argentina, Marcelo Bianchi, Guillermo Salinas y Jonathan Rosso-Di. Me gustaría decir un párrafo aparte sobre un significado especial que tiene para mí y para quienes estudiamos la obra de Marion en Argentina, que es la presencia de Robin Horner, cuyo libro pionero, bueno, a mí me inició en los estudios marionianos. Fue el primer libro escrito en inglés o en cualquier idioma sobre la obra de Marion, y muchos de nosotros empezamos a conocer la obra de Marion a través de su libro, así que te agradecemos. We are very grateful with you, Robin, and we are honored with your presence in this conference. And we are also honored with the presence of the what I like to call the inventors or the creators of Marion, which are not only Robin, no solamente Robin es la inventora de Marion en buena medida, sino también sus traductores. Contamos aquí con la presencia bueno, de Thomas Carlson, que ha sido, correct me, Thomas, if it is not right, si esto no es correcto. Thomas fue el primero que hizo una traducción de una obra de Marion al inglés. Y eso, ¿por qué digo que contribuyó a inventar a Marion? Porque logró una recepción muy importante a partir de esa publicación en inglés en Estados Unidos y en el mundo, diría yo, y en la academia estadounidense también. Y bueno, por supuesto, también contamos con la presencia de Stephen Lewis y de Jeffrey Koski, que han traducido obras muy importantes de Marion, así que bueno, lo digo un poco en chiste, un poco en serio, son los inventores. Eh, bueno, por lo menos han dado ese puntapié inicial para su fama mundial, ¿no? El tema convocante, como mencionó Damasia, es la noción de distancia, y esta idea es una idea que ha propuesto el propio Marion como el hilo conductor para su obra en su última obra publicada, que es una obra extraña que lleva por título Parcours de la distance, recorridos de la distancia. Eh, no sé, dejo acá a los traductores cómo traducirlo al inglés. How should we translate that in English? Parcours de la distance. No sé. Bueno. Traversal. Ok. Eh, en realidad es una compilación, ¿no? Es un libro que tiene una introducción donde él propone que la distancia puede servir como clave hermenéutica de su obra, pero en realidad el libro es una compilación que contiene 5 de sus obras, 5 de sus libros completos, o 4 de sus libros completos y una parte de otro. Bueno, pero en ese prefacio dice algunas cosas interesantes que voy a mencionar muy rápidamente. Sí, tenemos tiempo. Bueno, él lo que propone es que esta noción de distancia permite ensayar una lectura de los argumentos de estas obras desde otro punto de vista, propone un desplazamiento anamorfósico, mejor dicho, y también propone que cada una de esas obras implica una relectura de la anterior, ¿no? Dios sin el ser sería una relectura de El ídolo y la distancia, etcétera. Bueno, desde otro punto de vista y desde otro horizonte. En el ídolo y la distancia, Marión presenta la distancia, la noción de distancia, como el modo paradojal no de esconder la existencia de Dios, sino de dar cuenta de la insistencia de Dios en un ámbito que es constituido entre la medida de lo que somos o podemos recibir y la falta de medida de esa manifestación divina, ¿no? Eso es un poco el modo en el que él define la distancia en esa obra y también la relaciona y cree que esa distancia se manifiesta a través de la denominación, ¿no? A través de ese desnombrar, podríamos decir, que exhibe la esencial inadecuación de todo nombre respecto de Dios, ¿no? Se trata entonces, dice Marión, de pasar de la predicación que busca la definición a la alabanza que mienta a lo que Marión propone llamar el requerido, pero para que permanezca en tanto tal en su distancia. Bueno, en Dios sin el ser, que es la segunda obra que aparece en este libro, esta distancia conduce y se expresa en el ícono más allá de todo ídolo y sostiene la idea, quizás que da un poco de mayor claridad, de la importancia de que la distancia, de que para que pueda desplegarse la distancia es necesario un término, pero no entendido como un límite que no pueda ser atravesado, sino más bien un término que opera como una mirada que reconoce la distancia eh, y que nos devuelve de algún modo nuestra mirada, ¿no? O nuestra mención. Estos 2 primeros textos, dice Marión, son la pars destruens de su obra, y con prolegómenos a la caridad y el fenómeno erótico comienza la pars construens, ¿no? Con la idea de el amor, ¿no? El amor sirve para pensar a la distancia en un sentido positivo. La distancia abierta por el amor permite pensar de otro modo, dice Marión en este texto sobre prolegómenos a la caridad, permite pensar de otro modo la presencia, permite pensar una presencia sin presente. El ente y el objeto se dan como presencia en el presente, y ahí él juega con el término parusía, y según una esencia, según una usía. El fenómeno erótico parece poder prescindir de esta lógica del presente, ¿no? Luego pasa a hacer una reflexión sobre el fenómeno erótico, ¿no? Y ahí dice que en esa obra él exploró la lógica del amor y es destacable cómo esa lógica opera en el amante, en quien ama, como un adentrarse en una distancia sin garantías, ¿no? Sin la exigencia de la reciprocidad. El amor, dice Marion, da sustancia y constituye la lógica de esa distancia. Finalmente, y ya con esto termino, hay unas palabras sobre un esbozo preparatorio, un texto que es un esbozo preparatorio a D'ailleurs la revelación, en donde indaga en la univocidad del amor como el punto de partida que permite un cuestionamiento, él dice, filosófico de la demarcación ilustrada entre fe y razón, ¿no? Una acabada comprensión de la revelación en términos teológicos y filosóficos. Marion cierra el prefacio, y esto es un poco lo que me gustaría tomar como una invitación para las jornadas, cierra con una consigna, podríamos decir, ¿no? Él dice que, bueno, hasta ahora él lo que ha propuesto en estas obras es pensar la distancia en ese ámbito de la lógica erótica que parece operar aún en buena medida en el ámbito teológico, y lo que él dice es que hay que reinterpretar las operaciones a partir de las operaciones fenomenológicas a partir de esta idea de distancia y de amor, eh, incluso releyendo a Husserl y a Heidegger. Es decir, puede llevarse esta lógica y esta idea de la distancia al ámbito de los fenómenos ya no teológicos, sino eh, saturados de derecho común y pobres, pero de nuestra vida cotidiana. Bueno, es un gusto para mí entonces inaugurar estas quintas jornadas en torno a la obra de Jean-Luc Marion, intitulada Figuras de la Distancia. Muchas gracias. Bueno, y dale, gracias. Bueno, y es un placer para mí entonces presentar a la conferencia inaugural, al conferencista inaugural, al first plenary talk, que va a ser dictada por Stephen Lewis y que lleva por título De la estigmatización marioniana de la imaginación. Stephen Lewis es doctor por la Universidad de Chicago, es profesor en la Franciscan University of Steubenville. Es el traductor al inglés de las siguientes obras de Marion: Prolegomena to Charity, The Erotic Phenomenon, The Reason of the Gift, Negative Certainties y Giveness and Revelation. Y asimismo es el cotraductor de la publicación reciente del monumental Revelations Comes from Elsewhere. Bueno, es un gusto cederle la palabra a Steven. Yeah.
Bueno, few words in Spanish. Me gustaría agradecer a los organizadores de esta conferencia. Muchas gracias, Jorge, Ezequiel, Matías, Juan Pablo, por la invitación y por su hospitalidad siempre tan generosa. Okay. So yeah, the title is on Marion's Stigmatization of the Imagination. First part, openings after the hermeneutical critique. Critical discussions in North America over the last 20 years of Jean-Luc Marion's phenomenology of givenness, and in particular his phenomenology of revelation, have been structured by a purported alternative, which Darren E. Dahl lays out succinctly in a recent article. One side presents phenomenality in a way that precludes the work of interpretation, e.g. of religious texts, and posits a view of subjectivity in which the recipient of revelation is entirely passive. Marion's phenomenology has typically been assigned a place here. The hermeneutic approach, on the other hand, is said to focus precisely on the content of the texts of revelation as they are understood within their historical milieu. As a result, the question of meaning is privileged over that of phenomenality, and thus the self is understood as the acting and interpreting participant in a constructed and communal world. Through careful reading of Marion's own accounts of the place of hermeneutics in his phenomenology, Dahl shows convincingly that this alternative is false when it comes to Marion's phenomenology of givenness and of revelation. Givenness, as Marion presents it, that is, as the result of a phenomenological reduction that, quote, accomplishes the work of mediation insofar as it participates in the coming to appearance of the phenomenon itself, unquote, necessarily leads to interpretation because what is given is the thing itself in its appearance. Dahl comments, far from the work of interpretation being understood as the work of combination, construction, or even constitution, interpretation finds itself identified with the work of reception, unquote. Interpretation, in other words, is the work of a self, adonai, already given to oneself in the unrestrained givenness of the appearing of that which appears. Marion's position then, writes Dahl, cannot be drawn into the debate between an active and passive subject. Dahl's article may be the harbinger of a welcome movement forward in scholarly engagements with Marion's phenomenology, at least in English, taking us past the sticking point of hermeneutics. Others are finding Marion's account of the place and role of hermeneutics in his phenomenology compelling, or at least worth reading carefully. Among promising recent articles reconsidering the hermeneutic dimensions of Marion's phenomenology are articles by Tamsin Jones, published with a response by Robin Horner, and soon to appear in print in Continental Philosophy Review by Stephanie Rumsa. This gradual yet building recognition that Marion may in fact have come up with a coherent phenomenology after all, happily gives us the opportunity to attend to some of the features of that phenomenology that, through further illumination, could help us address significant questions and themes. Among these features is the, quote, resistance put up by the gifted as he or she phenomenalizes the given. And one of the questions a close look at it allows us to address is Marion's consistent stigmatization of the imagination as a deterrent to adhering to the truth of the real as it is given. Why this negative view of the imagination? And if indeed the imagination is to be understood as a necessary component of human thinking, can such stigmatization even be meaningful? Jones touches on this issue of resistance to the given, while Jorge Rogero, in his book and several related articles, investigates it in further depth. Both scholars zero in on a statement by Marion in his paper, The Hermeneutics of Givenness, about the role of hermeneutics in the reception of the given in his phenomenology. Hermeneutics, Marion writes, manages the gap between what shows itself and what gives itself by interpreting the call, or often the intuition, by the response, the concept or signification. In answer, Jones wonders, quote, how does the receiver manage this gap by which what is given rise to visibility is shown, by which what is given rise to visibility is shown? And she connects this management with what Marion calls in the Hermeneutics of Givenness and many other places, the Adonai's resistance to the given. Focusing on religious experience, she repeats the suggestion first made in her book on Marion and patristic thought from 2011, that such resistance could take the form of the contemplative practices of religious men and women. Rogero likewise appreciated this connection between gap management and resistance, which he discusses in his 2019 book, Hermeneutica del Amor. Taking into account Marion's many descriptions of painters and their work as examples of reception of the given, Rogero has argued that in Marion's phenomenology, the painter is a privileged figure of the gifted, and that therefore we ought to look at Marion's descriptions of the work of painting to understand resistance to the given. As Rogero puts it, in Marion's phenomenology of givenness, quote, art can literally do things. Art can phenomenalize the unseen. Accepting the call of the given, the artist implements in practice a hermeneutical answer through his painting, unquote. The non-imaginative nature of resistance to the given is ultimately what I am interested in exploring here. In order to get into it, I will first outline relatively briefly two issues that Rogero has discussed in detail. Rogero. One, Marion's account of the painter as Adonai and his or her practice of a non-imaginative hermeneutical resistance to the given in order to bring it to phenomenality. And two, the fact that for Marion, resistance to the given involves a decision to love it or hate it. This is what Rogero calls Marion's hermeneutics of love. After setting this stage, we can then explore the ramifications of the non-imaginative nature of resistance in Marion and the place and value of imagination in his phenomenology of givenness more broadly. And that in turn will allow me to draw some initial conclusions about where this animus against imagination begins in Marion's work and why. Certainly, Marion's claim that great artists do not use their imaginations is, before anything else, striking and surprising. The imagination, no matter how we define it, is clearly integral to human thought and life. Marion's claim obviously runs counter to how most people, including many philosophers, conceive of both artistic activity and our experience of art. And of course, popular constructivist accounts of reality are entirely based on an exaltation of the imagination. Why then does Marion assign the imagination no positive role at all in the making of great art? Does the problem have to do with the time in which the great painters, and we as well, live? Has something happened culturally, perhaps the rise of ideology, to damage our imaginations or make it more likely that we will use them incorrectly? For Marion, all resistance to the given in some way involves the decision to love or hate. Does this mean then that the problem with the imagination for Marion is ultimately a problem of love? If so, how and why? Part 2, resistance to the given, a decision made out of love or hate. I'll start with the second issue, the essentially erotic nature of resistance, because it is something I had the chance to discuss during my presentation at Jornadas Marion 4 in 2023, and many of you will be familiar with it because of similar points Rogero makes in his book Hermeneutica del Amor. In a footnote found in the Self's Place, The Approach of St. Augustine, in chapter 3, section 21, Marion makes a connection between what he is saying there about one's resistance to the event of truth and what he wrote years earlier in Excess, Studies in Saturated Phenomena, about the Adonais or gifted's resistance to the event of givenness, particularly as it plays out in the experience of a painter of genius. That's Marion's word. This is where Marion first uses the metaphor of a filament giving off light and heat as it resists an electric current to characterize the Adonais' resistance to what is given. In that presentation, after expanding on the connection between the two books, I summed up with the following words, and Juan Pablo translated it, the way in which Marion presents resistance to the given as an erotic decision to love or hate the truth of the given. And now I'll read English, Spanish a little bit. Under the accusing light of the truth, the precise reasons why the gifted cannot bear the given, whether the given be the holiness of God or the truth of some other thing, are made patently evident to him. His finitude, yes, but also his inequality, his darkness, his disgrace. And the given truth's goal, so to speak, in drawing the gifted into this drama of resistance or in doing the truth to the gifted, is to invite the gifted to decide, yes or no, whether he loves the truth of the thing given more than his own idea of it. Quote, he can no longer remain before the givenness of the thing just an impartial spectator who would see from a neutral position, unquote. Marion sums this up by writing, quote, only the love of truth in the aspect of beauty permits enduring the veritas redargens without succumbing to its hatred, unquote. And he then proceeds in chapter 4, Weakness of Will or Power of Love, section 23, Temptation and the Fact of Self, to show how this ordeal of resistance continues in time, in and through the phenomenon of temptation. Thus, the full account of the gifted's resistance to the event of the given as introduced in Excess chapter 2 is filled out or completed by the description in the Self's Place of the erotic decision-making that necessarily determines and drives it. With all of that in mind, let us now turn to the first issue concerning the fate of the imagination in the, quote, phenomenological theory of art, unquote, that Marion sketches in Excess, and then develops in greater detail in Courbet ou la peinture à l'œil, a theory which, he says, encompasses not only the non-imaginative nature of painting and the other plastic arts, but also literary production and indeed all speculative thought, he says. Here is the relevant passage from In Excess. The great painter never invents anything as if the given were lacking. On the contrary, he or she puts up with or suffers resisting against this excess to the point of making it render its visibility, like making someone cough up a payment. Mark Rothko resists what he has received as a violent given, too violent for anyone other than him, by phenomenalizing it on the screen of his flat colors. I have imprisoned the most utter violence in every square inch of the painting's surface. What holds for the arts holds for literature and all speculative thought, an immense effort of resistance to the given in order to phenomenalize it as far as the Adonai can bear it. Genius consists only in a great resistance to the impact of the given revealing itself. In all cases, the phenomenon, which happens as an event, takes the figure of the revealed, that is to say, it phenomenalizes the Adonai in the same gesture wherein the Adonai forces what gives itself to show itself a little more. End of the quote. Particularly worthy of attention in this probably familiar passage is the criterion for artistic greatness and its extension beyond art to genius in all realms of experience, because it speaks directly to the incompatibility between reception of the event and at least certain uses of the imagination. In his or her resistance to the given, the great painter never invents anything, because this involves the imaginary deployment of mental images, a way of thinking stemming from the objectification of phenomena. Marion makes this point at greater length and more vividly in his 2014 book on the French 19th century painter Gustave Courbet. Courbet paints by eye or from view, à l'œil, de vue, meaning that he receives phenomena decisively in the position of the gifted. For an illustration that always strikes me when I read it, see Marion's presentation of an onlooker's account of Courbet's painting of a pile of firewood. This way of painting is contrasted with those who paint by idea, à l'idée, working through foreseen or pre-seen images, and thus principally by imagination. Two passages give us a good sense of what Marion means. These are from Courbet, the book on Courbet. Making art by ideas is exactly what one should not do, because one should paint by view, à vue. But it will be objected, how would one not paint by view? How could one paint otherwise than by seeing? Answer, by seeing too well and too often, and then by reseeing, retaining, and constituting what one had seen. In this manner, one begins with a theme, a story, an episode drawn from the Bible or the ancients, a captivating or surprising scene, a Spartan general before a hopeless battle, an Oriental massacre, an abduction of women, an angel struggling with a man, the apotheosis of a poet, etc. Here, the idea is located, shaped, prepared, refined, polished. In short, it is transformed little by little into an image. It is imagined. And then from a few pages later, one has great difficulty seeing Ingres agreeing to paint the source of the Loup or the waterfall at Siratu, not only because he never painted something comparable, but because one cannot imagine or figure or compose these surging flows of water. They impose themselves from themselves in the endlessly renewed instant of movement arising out of the depths of the earth and submerging the gaze. One can only paint them by eye, never by idea. The resistance that manages the gap between what shows itself and what gives itself by interpreting the call by the response, or in other words, the undergoing of the ordeal of saying yes or refusing to do so to the light of the truth of what gives itself, is ever at odds with the imaginative manipulation of mental representations of reality. And what is at stake in this distinction between resistance to the given and use of the imagination is, it seems, nothing less than the human encounter with the real. If one finds Marion's phenomenology of givenness at all compelling, with its emphasis on the meaningful agency of saturated phenomena or events that call for my resistant response, this stigmatization of the imagination, understood bluntly as a subset of representational, objectifying thinking, ought to make sense. For if my attention is completely trained on the representations that I produce mentally and to which I attempt to make phenomena conform, I am less likely to make a decision in front of events that are irreversible, foregone, and unforeseeable. But it is important to recognize that this stigmatization of imagination is not in any sense a phenomenological requirement. Part 3, Romano, Sartre, Husserl, and the imagination. We can see that this is so simply by reading a compelling sample of a phenomenology of the imagination. In an article entitled La consistance de l'imaginaire, Claude Romano argues for the valuable role a phenomenological account of the imaginary can play in successfully accounting for the deep relationship between the reality of the world and the mental or inner world of the imagination, especially the literary imagination, and vice versa. By the end of this article, he offers a phenomenological analysis of the way in which the imaginary world of a work of literature draws on, shares in, and contributes formatively to the larger world in which it appears. After reviewing structuralist and other philosophical approaches to imaginative literature that reduce the phenomenal aspects of a literary text strictly to its linguistic and semantic properties, or deem it non-referential make-believe, or foreground logical consideration of the possible worlds fiction evokes without ever getting beyond the possible, Romano presents the merits of a few phenomenological approaches to the literary imaginary. The phenomenological point of view is especially productive if we want to see how the literary refers to and connects with the real. This is because, he writes, for phenomenology, quote, the imagination is not a mental faculty. It is something that can be analyzed by following the guiding thread of the way or mode in which certain objects are given. It designates, above all, a dimension of our experience, unquote. Like objects of perception, imaginary objects give themselves in various sensory modalities. There is a visual imagination as well as an acoustic, a tactile, and an olfactive one. This is evident when we read, even silently, for literary material is primarily something we listen to. There is an imaginary voice that the reading of a text produces in us, and the style in which it speaks to us outlines for us a style of life, as Merleau-Ponty argued, through the way in which a written piece moves within language. Quote, to write is not to consign ideas or fictions to paper. It is to inhabit language in a different way. Habiter la langue. To read is to follow the modulations and inflections of a style, to see the universe through the writing. It is the prolongation of the writer's corporal being in the world, which is addressed to the being in the world of the reader, unquote. Thus, the notions of author and of reader, which in the more objectivist approaches to the literary, such as structuralism, are so idealized that they become trivial, are in fact highly sophisticated. Quote, the participation that happens at the heart of the work in the incarnated relation to the writer's language, with its manner of inhabiting language and of approaching the world through a style, is what is essential. And this is why relations of author and reader must be led back as much as possible to the ground on which they are worked out, that of our Lebenswelt. In addition to leading us into such imaginative encounters between the worlds and styles of life of writer and reader, narrative arts, Romano continues, also introduce us to imagine scenes, characters, situations, and atmospheres, which are frequently summed up by the term imaginary worlds. French thought in the first 4 decades or so of the 20th century is marked by intense theoretical interest in and speculation about the imaginary and the imagination. Jean-Paul Sartre published his 2-part study, L'imagination and l'imaginaire, in 1936 and 1940, respectively, at the tail end of the period during which the foundational surrealist texts on the imagination appeared. One way to understand Sartre's combined study is as a phenomenological rejection, inspired by early works of Husserl, of the surrealist exaltation of the imagination and its purported revolutionary power. Romano emphasizes that Sartre rejects the idea of an imaginary world as a misnomer, because what is imagined in fiction or artwork does not have the consistency of a world. Romano points out that Sartre's position rests ultimately on the reduction of the imagination to an inner consciousness of the image that sets the entire field of the imaginary in conflict with the perception of the real. The imaginary is thus defined by Sartre as a negation of the actually perceived real, a negation which, moreover, occurs in us spontaneously. Now, I'll make a quick parenthesis here. So one of Marion's teachers, Ferdinand Alquier, who's a great Descartes scholar, also wrote a very important book called The Philosophy of Surrealism. And if you ever study surrealism, you have to read this book. It was published in the 50s. And so I just am curious the extent to which that book or even this philosophical surrealist, the extent to which it impacted positively or negatively his students. And I just have not been able to track down anything in terms of whether Marion was impacted by that at all. But it would seem negatively if he was. Okay, Sartre notes Romano depends primarily on Husserl's first account of the imagination, laid out in the fifth of his logical investigations. There, Husserl understands representative imagining as differing from perception in that it rests upon the act of apprehension or interpretation applied to the contents of consciousness. Husserl writes, quote, it is an imaging interpretation that sets an imagined rather than a perceptual appearance before us, where experienced sensations mediate the appearance of a pictorially presented object, e.g. a centaur in a painting. One sees at once that the very same thing which, in relation to the intentional object, is called its presentation, i.e. the perceiving, remembering, picturing, symbolizing intention directed towards it, is also called an interpretation, conception, apperception, in relation to the sensations really present in this act. Beginning in 1909, however, as Romano relates, Husserl criticizes his first doctrine of the imagination for two primary reasons. He finds that it does not allow us to understand the difference between the imagination proper, Fantasie, and image consciousness, Bildbewusstsein, and, as Romano puts it, it fails to recognize the specific mode of givenness, mode de donner, of the imagined object by aligning it, in a sense, on that of the perceived object, and by making their difference rest on the sole act of apprehension. Romano proceeds then to discuss in greater detail the distinctions between perception, memory, imagination, and image consciousness that Husserl developed, distinctions that allowed him to trace the nuanced interweavings of presence and presentification in imagining, such that the imagination is no longer seen as a source of illusion in conflict with perception, as Sartre sees it, but rather a way of thinking that operates in relation to it, functioning on its own level or plane. Romano offers as an example of this second Husserlian approach a short analysis of a photograph of the Eiffel Tower, demonstrating how this interweaving operates. For Husserl, image consciousness is not bifurcated between, on the one hand, the perceptive apprehension or interpretation of the image thing, and on the other, the presentification of a fiction or a phantasm. Instead, as Romano puts it, quote, the fiction is given nowhere else than in the image itself, and more precisely, in the image object. The Eiffel Tower appears nowhere else than in the photographic image, even while it is not this image, but is only figured in it. Unlike Sartre's analysis, which sees the world and the imaginary as irreparably separate, Husserl's second account of the imagination allows us, quote, to do justice to the different modalities of the imagination, to its complex relations with perception and its intrinsic consistency. For Romano, the sophistication of the Husserlian analysis allows one to take into account many of the phenomenal features of theater and fiction, especially the ways in which, as narrative arts, they guide the imagination without making it lose its relative autonomy. This counters Sartre's insistence on the imagination as spontaneous. Instead, the imagination can be free or directed, as shown by the fact that judgments about an imaginary world can be shared, argued about, and agreed upon among spectators or readers. From here, Romano approaches the conclusion of his masterful paper, moving past Husserl, whom nevertheless he criticizes for stopping short of working out the imaginary world's relations with the real world. Romano turns to his own eventual hermeneutics. Final section of the paper shows how, quote, fiction, through the detour of the imaginary, can bring us back to the very world it samples, and of which in many ways it constitutes the revealer, initiating us to the real world in its mysterious thickness and its perpetual inchoative welling up, a feat that philosophy on its own cannot accomplish, he says. There are a number of points of contact as well as separation between Romano's critical presentation of a successful phenomenology of the imagination and Marion's, quote, phenomenological theory of art, unquote. The argumentative impetus of Romano's discussion is his conviction that a philosophical approach to the literary has to adequately account for the revealing or initiating relationship between the imaginary worlds unfolding in its pages on the one hand, and the world as such on the other, and that phenomenology alone among philosophies is capable of doing this. For his part, Marion clearly shares the conviction that artworks initiate us to the real and reveal it. Indeed, he argues in both The Crossing of the Visible and, as we have seen, the book on Courbet, that the painter's work augments and deepens the visible real for the viewer. The difference between the two philosophers may seem obvious then. Marion sets up the seeing that leads to this augmentation of the real in opposition to the conceiving of images in the imagination, while Romano sees the imaginary, which he identifies as the ultimate referent of all art, as inherently related to perception of the real. But this assumed difference falls apart when scrutinized. Romano states that a phenomenological approach to art begins with the guiding thread of what is given in perception, including in perceptual imagination. And in Romano as well as Marion, the artist must make a decision in front of that given. To be sure, this decision is foregrounded in Marion in a way that it is not in Romano's article. And for Marion, the distinction between great and mediocre artists and art plays out in the decision made by the artist in front of that given, a decision that is at root an erotic one. When Marion stigmatizes the imaginary and the imagination, he is discrediting the decision that would lead the artist and the viewer away from deciding to receive the truth of the real, and instead toward immersion within his or her ideas about reality. Such decision-making is certainly not the focus of Romano's article, yet he acknowledges, and how could he not, that there is such a thing as bad art and unsuccessful poetry. To repeat, the decisions that might go into writing and reading something that in fact is not worth reading are not his primary concern. Nevertheless, at the conclusion of Romano's text, he states that what is wrong with even the second Husserlian phenomenology of the imagination is its tendency to limit the imagining subject. The imagining subject is, quote, essentially a subject of knowledge, and thus his reactions, his judgments, his emotions are added from the exterior onto an attitude that is first of all fundamentally theoretical. His imagination remains purely contemplative, a knowledge of fictive objects and nothing else. So that's what is still wrong with the second Husserlian phenomenology. When instead the concept of imagination is widened, the one who reads is not the reader, but instead an individuality rich in experience, engaged from the beginning in stories, or as Sartre says, on board and launched, or embarqué. But the reading is also an alert sensibility. The reader is also an alert sensibility, attentive to the nuances of the construction of a text, to the melody of a sentence, apt to fill in or not the ellipses and breaks in the text. We read like we understand with everything that we are. This is why the reader is never just any old reader, nor is his imagination that of just anyone. Reading is the event of an encounter with the work at the furthermost edge of singularity, where the constellation of our unsubstitutable existence plays out. End of quote. The reader described here has clearly made a decision in favor of the truth of the work. To put it in terms Marion might use, he or she has decided that responding to the call in the work is worthwhile. Plenty of details would need to be worked out to make a fully convincing case, but the portrait of the reader Romano offers is in many ways close to the loving reader described by Cassandra Falk in her phenomenological analysis, deeply informed and shaped by Marion, of love and reading. Nevertheless, despite this underlying commitment to a profound referential relationship between art and the real, and the decisions necessary to maintain it, the two philosophers clearly emphasize different things. Marion writes at length about the choice involved in resisting the given in order to phenomenalize it, while Romano does not address such an ordeal. And Romano writes in detail about the imagination as not only an important philosophical question, but a phenomenologically complex one, while Marion does not. Part 4, poetically man dwells in distance. Heidegger and Marion on Hölderlin and the first outline of resistance. Up to this point, we have been relying on Marion's accounts of resistance to the given that postdate the publication of Being Given. But to read what is arguably the most intricate account of resistance in Marion's work, we have to go backwards, specifically to the essay on the German poet Friedrich Hölderlin contained in The Idle and Distance. This is a particularly difficult chapter to understand within a difficult book. The difficulty lies largely in sorting out how Marion's ideas relate and interact precisely with those expressed by the poet in the poem that Marion focuses on in Lovely Blue, in Lieblicher Blau, and how Marion's reading relates to Heidegger's reading of the same poem in his essay Poetically Man Dwells, which Marion refers to explicitly in his text. My intention is to show how, with a different vocabulary, for instance, words like purity and endurance play the role that words like decision and resistance will play later, and a focus on poetry instead of painting, Marion develops at length in the Hölderlin chapter what can be understood as a preliminary outline of what will later become his phenomenological theory of art. I will attempt then to navigate through the complexities of this text in order to zero in on the question of the role played by the imagination and how that role impacts our understanding of why, for Marion, the imagination can get in the way of the reception of what is given. As a way to frame this discussion, I will compare Marion's interpretation with Heidegger's. Within the larger argument of the idle and distance, Marion sees Hölderlin contributing an alternative to two opposed and equally unattractive forms of possible human relation with the divine. On the one hand, the pole of nostalgia, in Hölderlin's case, nostalgia for ancient Greece, lived in the face of an experience of divine absence. And on the other hand, the pole of annihilation through divinely initiated communion or fusion with the divine in death, a position dramatized for Hölderlin by Empedocles. At the end of Interlude 1, Marion describes Hölderlin's proposal. Quote, Hölderlin escapes this alternative only by rising to think an unthinkable paradox. The intimacy of man with the divine grows with, rather than diminishes, the gap that distinguishes them. The withdrawal of the divine would perhaps constitute its ultimate figure of revelation. This is what we attempt to delineate under the name of distance. Unquote. Marion makes his argument through a dense, painstaking analysis of Hölderlin's poem, often contextualizing his interpretation with references to other poems by Hölderlin, as well as his letters. Thomas Faux has remarked that a great deal of Hölderlin interpretation involves patient, slow, and therefore often painful to read line-by-line commentary. In this sense, Marion follows the tendency. Probably the most striking difference between Heidegger's and Marion's respective interpretations of the poem lies in the parts of the poem upon which each thinker concentrates. As the title of his essay makes clear, Heidegger's attention is centered on the kind of dwelling that poetry makes possible, and thus the lines surrounding the verses, quote, poetically man dwells on this earth, are highlighted. Marion, in contrast, focuses primarily on Hölderlin's words figure, Gestalt, and image, build, and what their use in the poem shows about Hölderlin's dramatic struggle to maintain on his human end the human-divine relationship established by God's distance. Marion's study thus begins with the poem's opening description, quote, in lovely blue the steeple blossoms with its metal roof. Marion immediately settles our gaze on a silhouette that descends the steps of the belfry, setting itself out against the lovely and loving blue of the sky, where it is measured within the belfry's framing window arch and resolves itself into a figure, Gestalt, or is put into an image, Bildsamkeit, mise en image, as he puts it, imaged, as the translation offers. Marion writes, quote, within the sensible appearance of a silhouette, the poet sees appear the mystery of the apparition of a man, that a man might be able to assume figure in an image as one takes root or not in a soil. This figuring and imaging is at the heart of our concerns here, and each thinker interprets Hölderlin's account of the image of man in a different way. Heidegger comes to poetic imaging after having reached the conclusion that what is poetic in human dwelling is the, quote, taking of measure, the fundamental human activity of gauging what is human about human being. Quote, according to Hölderlin's words, man spans the dimension between heaven and earth by measuring himself against the heavenly. Man does not undertake this spanning just now and then. Rather, man is man at all, only in such spanning, unquote. This act of measuring the span is, Heidegger says, not the quantitative numbering activity that we normally associate with the verb to measure. Rather, it is, quote, taking the measure which then is applied in every measuring act. To write poetry is measure-taking, understood in the strict sense of the word, by which man first receives the measure for the breadth of his being, unquote. Once this understanding of poetic dwelling as the taking of measure is established, Heidegger moves on to ask what Hölderlin means when he writes, As long as kindness lasts, pure within his heart, he may gladly measure himself against the divine. Is God unknown? Is he manifest as the sky? This I tend to believe, such is man's measure. Heidegger explains that as the measure of man, God is precisely understood to be this unknown one. Quote, the measure consists in the way in which the God who remains unknown is revealed as such by the sky. God's appearance through the sky consists in a disclosing that lets us see what conceals itself, but lets us see it not by seeking to wrest what is concealed out of its concealedness, but only by guarding the concealed in its self-concealment. Thus, the unknown God appears as the unknown by way of the sky's manifestness. This appearance is the measure against which man measures himself. End of quote. The poetic image, then, results for Heidegger from the poet's saying of this appearing of the concealed in its concealedness. To develop this further, Heidegger employs a pair of concepts, the alien and the familiar, to describe how this appearing of the invisible as invisible occurs in poetic language. Quote, the unknown, that is the God, imparts himself precisely to what is alien to him, namely the sight of the blue sky, the sunlight flashing on the metal roof, the cries of the swallows, the creaking of the weathercock, all of which are familiar to us, quote, in order to remain guarded within it as the unknown. The poet calls in the sights of the sky that which in its very self-disclosure causes the appearance of that which conceals itself, and indeed as that which conceals itself, end of quote. In other words, quote, the genuine image lets the invisible be seen and so imagines the invisible in something alien to it, end of quote. The agency in Heidegger's sentence here is striking in that it seems to be the image that is imagining, not the poet. But the paragraph begins with a sentence that makes clear that in and through his poetic imaging activity, the poet's experience of the God's point of view on the alien and the familiar renders his own experience to some extent divine. Quote, the poet makes poetry only when he takes the measure by saying the sights of heaven in such a way that he submits to its appearances as to the alien element to which the unknown God has yielded. End of quote. The poet, in imaging the unknown God, experiences the God's yielding to the alien, and so sees what is humanly familiar as alien, thus inhabiting the divine point of view. This is why, writes Heidegger, poetic images are imaginings in a distinctive sense, not mere fancies and illusions, but imaginings that are visible inclusions of the alien in the sight of the familiar. The poetic saying of images gathers the brightness and sound of the heavenly appearances into one with the darkness and silence of what is alien. By such sights, the God surprises us. In this strangeness, he proclaims his unfaltering nearness. End of quote. This nearness of the God, which in fact may really be the fruit of the poet's accomplished playing of the familiar against the alien and vice versa, rather than any God's initiative, will be directly contradicted by Marion's insistence on the mutual withdrawal of God and the poet into a distance from one another. Whereas Heidegger begins with dwelling, then investigates measure, and finally comes to describe the image and poetic imaging, Marion begins with his interpretation of Hölderlin's understanding of imaging, Bildsamkeit, and proceeds from there to the questions of measure and dwelling. This is significant because for Marion, images and imaging, understood as constitutive of a mutual relationship between the human poet and the divine, are the key to Hölderlin's poetic achievement. Marion's first step towards Hölderlin's imaging lies in an effort to explain the figure in which the silhouette in the stoned arch window of the belfry appears against the lovely blue. Purity allows the poet's gaze to discern the figure as a spiritual reality that reproduces, quote, the man, but does not present itself in nature. Quoting here and there from In Lovely Blue, Marion lays out a decisive poetic position before the real called purity, which is Hölderlin's term, that certainly seems to the reader of Marion's later work to be related to the erotic decision in front of the truth that determines whether phenomenalizing resistance to the given will take place or not. In addition to the moral valence of the word purity, it is worth noting the moral significance of such terms as seriousness, Holderlin's term, and endurance, Marion's term. Marion writes, quote, "In purity, like another optical milieu, the spirit becomes perceptible. The imperceptible takes on a figure in it. Such seriousness allows endurance of the light, wherein the spirit makes figures rise up in the crepuscular lack of figure. Then poetically man can state its seriousness and the self-sufficient word," end of quote. This purity of gaze and seriousness of spirit, which allow the figure to arise, continue their decisive role as the figure is, quote, "put into an image" or imaged. This is perhaps the moment in Marion's interpretation that is most charged with the moral dimension of decision in front of the given. This is a longer quote here, sorry about that. The image, which arises from the gaze that images it, Bildsamkeit, invests the entire essence, Wesen, of the thing in the silhouette where the figure stands out. This coincidence of the figure in the image is known by the painter, who sees the thing establish itself in the visible all of a sudden. Holderlin designates and experiences this coincidence. And here he's quoting from Holderlin. Yet so simple, these images, so very holy, one fears to describe them. Sacred simplicity, Marion continues, of the image that appears in a figure, man in the arched window. Whoever has seen it has known the fear. Whoever reads the opening of the poem without experiencing it in his depths must not continue here. What follows will escape him forever. The image must not be described because the prodigious simplicity gives rise to fear. That fear, calm and discreet, imperceptible and invisible for the most part, belongs to the imaging, Bildsamkeit, in its essence. To express the emergence of the invisible into visibility implies that fear halos the visible. Man whose purity must endure the spirit also offers himself to fear, because fear springs from the imaging. Man must endure that fear as long as he poetically receives the image. How to remain pure and up to what point? To this question, the very question of imaging, Holderlin offers no other response than a redoubling of the aporia. Man must endure the trial of the image by imitating the celestials, die Himmlischen, which is translated by Richard Siebert simply as gods, but Marion translates it as the celestials. Since he takes his image from them, the image of divinity. So the last bit there, man must endure the trial of the image by imitating the celestials, since he takes his image from them, the image of divinity. Okay, this is a dense passage about imaging and how Holderlin understands man to be the image of divinity, and its difficulty lies largely in the fact that Holderlin describes no image at all. The reference to painting perhaps helps if we read it in light of examples from Marion's later writing, such as Courbet's bundle of firewood, the image of which only emerges for Courbet after he has painted it. Marion points out that for Holderlin, out of respect for the holiness of the image and the fear that belongs to the imaging in its essence, there will be no description in the poem of the image of the figure of the man, and thus no attempt by the interpreter, Marion, to render it either. Indeed, Marion tells the reader, if you don't experience yourself the fear at the imaging of the man when reading the poem, you will never understand what Holderlin is doing. The fact that Heidegger never talks about the figure or the imaging of the man in the poem takes on weight here. The purity and endurance involved in letting the invisible emerge into the visibility of an image may seem akin to what Heidegger described in his writing about the image when he emphasized the importance of a kind of restraint in the poet, who must not, quote, wrest what is concealed out of its concealedness, unquote, or engage in, quote, a clutching or any other kind of grasping, but instead surrender to, quote, a letting come of what has been dealt out. But Marion's commentary on the holiness and fear Holderlin finds surrounding the act of imaging leads us to understand the poet's description of man measuring himself against the divine as a non-grasping that occurs within a mutually attentive relationship, for such holiness and fear are felt for someone. Integral to this relationship, characterized by Holderlin as the result of the celestial's loving kindness toward the poet, leads Marion to a characterization of that measuring in terms of withdrawal and distance. Measuring against the unknown one in Heidegger leads to its nearness in the image. For Marion, in contrast, it leads to a, quote, friendly relationship of distance, which opens a perspective that allows for seeing. Taking up Hölderlin's saying of man's aspiration toward the celestials by measuring himself against them and thereby being the image of divinity, Marion emphasizes Hölderlin's description of the celestials' kindness and the fact that they are, quote, rich in virtue and joy, unquote. Therefore, in measuring himself against them, man finds a welcome, and this welcome opens the friendly space of perspective, distance, that allows for the seeing of images. Where Heidegger quoted Hölderlin's verse about man being called an image of the Godhead, but avoided probing its meaning, Marion suggests that imaging for man grows out of his first being imaged by the divine within a two-way relationship based on respectful withdrawal. Another long quote, and I apologize. The celestials, and through them the divinity, surprise the expected purity of man and provide for it by their virtue and their joy, where we recognize what is outlined by our kindness. Kindness, Freundlichkeit, gives rise to friendship, where the other remains at a distance that preserves its appearing. The celestials remain at a distance, and thus they can see images. Their withdrawal alone welcomes the rise of the visible. Or rather, the visible receives the imprint and the homage of a rise, as one speaks of the rising of sap, only through the reception arranged by a withdrawal. The celestials save épargne, so this is not save in the sense of salvation, but saving, like saving money, in order not to possess, to let flower the image where things take shape. What Hölderlin means by saving registers the step back that opens up perspective, as the altitude of an aerial view allows figures and contours to appear that are missed by the overly terrestrial gaze. If the gaze of the celestials properly arranges a withdrawal for things in order to receive their image, man will have to imitate that withdrawal, but doubly because he welcomes the rise of images only by maintaining himself as an image of divinity, which only a withdrawal can allow to appear. Before arranging a withdrawal, man must benefit from a withdrawal that allows him to take figure in an image. This is indeed why the gods withdraw. They withdraw before the man who becomes for them an image, just as man must withdraw in order that the invisibility of the world should become an image for him. The sky withdraws in order to offer in lovely blue the background and the basis for every taking of an image of things. Far from erasing it, this withdrawal ensures God's prior and unavoidable attentiveness. End of the quote. From this mutually attentive relationship of double imaging made possible by divine withdrawal and its human imitation, Marion arrives at what he thinks Hölderlin means by measure. The imitation of one withdrawal by the other is the measure. And this again contrasts significantly with Heidegger. As we saw, Heidegger says poetry is measure-taking, which is to say the reception of the measure for the breadth of man's very being. Measure-taking seems to be what opens the possibility of establishing dimension, the spanning of the distance between earth and sky, the first step in dwelling. In this sense, Heidegger's measure-taking appears to function somewhat like the space of perspective opened by the relationship of mutual withdrawal between human beings and God in Marion's reading. But against this similarity, the difference stands out all the more starkly. Heidegger's Hölderlin relates to the divine only through his thinking, directed at the unknown one without clutching or grasping. The poet receives nothing, no revelation from that target. In contrast, Marion's account of imaging in Hölderlin sees it as a relationship in which the poet responds through imitation to the kindly, welcoming withdrawal of the divine, which preserves the divine from human projections, and this mutual imaging establishes a corresponding measure where the human effort to imitate the divine measure of withdrawal comes always in response to and falls short of what the divine gives of itself. Thus, in Marion's account, in the third long quotation here, God himself, as welcoming withdrawal, establishes a measure, that of his very withdrawal. That of which man takes the measure in order to establish his own measure is the measure established by the God through his withdrawal. But just as the God gives his full measure only in his withdrawal, and only he who thus withdraws knows the number of his steps, no one knows the measure of the divine withdrawal. Imitating the divine requires not only that one share and transpose into our own destiny its withdrawal, but even that one not measure the measure of that withdrawal. The divine keeps a just measure, which man imitates in achieving it only by bearing the burden of having alone to determine his meaning, that is, by doing it justice. To determine for oneself the measure in which one attains his most proper good is for a man less an absurdly solitary destiny than a task where, by the grace of the divine withdrawal, he becomes its image. What purity here maintains, that man is the image of divinity, touches on the exclusive manner of traversing the distance that, in its withdrawal, man ensures for the image of the world, namely poetically. Here, once again, there is an emphasis on the decisions the poet makes out of respect for the divine in order to say the world in images. The decision to do justice, to seek the good in company, to practice a reserve and purity of intention, to endure the unknown. These are not described in terms of love and hate, but it is not hard to see that they involve a loving response. At this point in his study, Marion quotes Heidegger's text for the first and only time, drawing from the passage about poetry as measure-taking. Marion then follows this quote by writing, quote, "Only the naming that respects withdrawal can inspect the image." This short sentence, "only the naming that respects withdrawal can inspect the image," sums up well Marion's fundamental difference with Heidegger in the interpretation of Hölderlin's poem and his poetic aims, while at the same time allowing us to identify a starting point for Marion's efforts to avoid appealing to the imagination when describing the resistance to givenness. The fundamental difference lies in the centrality for Hölderlin, according to Marion, of withdrawal, distance, and the kind and joyful relationship between the divine and the human that they outline. Heidegger's account of imaging, when viewed in relation to Marion's later stigmatization of the imagination, indeed seems too imaginative in the sense of idea-centered. As we noted earlier, the poetic playing of the alien against the familiar in order to imagine the concealed in its concealedness seems destined to lead to the gradual collapse of the poet into the god as he experiences what he imagines to be the god's experience of yielding to the alien. Marion's poet, by contrast, understands his imaging activity always as a response to his own being imaged by the divine. The imagination is thus not first and foremost a faculty possessed by the poet that arranges mental pictures, the exercise of which could lead him into an infinite self-reflection, a maddening self-mirroring. Such self-mirroring, Marion shows, is the tragic experience of Hölderlin's Oedipus, who comes to the forefront in the last part of In Lovely Blue. In Oedipus's imaging relation to the divine, quote, "reflection is substituted for withdrawal. Distance, which the mirror only mimed, disappears from the phantasm of images. This imaginary, by imaging too easily, abandons both distance and image," unquote. In contrast, Hölderlin's imaging, exercised in the poem's opening in fear of such contamination by the self that is always discreet and pure in its actions, is carried out in constant relationship with the divine's welcoming withdrawal, where every image is discovered rather than constructed as it rises up out of the divine measure's dynamic self-manifestation. So a conclusion. What I presented here is the beginning, or something, of an investigation into Marion's stigmatizing mistrust of any imaginary efforts to resist and thus phenomenalize the given. I have made two primary points. The first is that compelling and robust phenomenological accounts of the imagination and the imaginary, and the imaginary as modes of our experience of the real seem at first to run counter to Marion's stigmatizing of the imagination. But upon further examination, it appears unlikely that Marion would reject them. As we saw, they seem to describe how we receive what is given in experience, which is also, of course, Marion's concern. But the erotic dimension of resistance, central to Marion's hermeneutical phenomenology, is generally not discussed in these phenomenologies of the imagination, and this particular difference between Marion and other important phenomenological thinkers raises questions about why it has arisen. The second main point made here is that Marion's mistrust of the imagination as a deterrence from attending to the given real arises quite early in his work and is developed in a critical dialogue with Heidegger on Hölderlin's In Lovely Blue. Central in this critical dialogue is Marion's conviction that for Hölderlin imaging, in order to be true, must respect divine withdrawal, a conviction that Marion also happens to believe is correct, and which runs counter to Heidegger's account of imaging that brings the God near. If we assume for the sake of argument that Marion is right to mistrust the imagination, some of the questions I listed earlier about the possible historical and cultural reasons for that mistrust arise and beckon. Matthew W. McGuire has identified a historical account of the imagination within French thought that begins in Pascal and is further developed in Rousseau and Tocqueville. According to this account, the imagination, quote, appears as the faculty that sustains, shapes, magnifies, and intensifies all forms of desire, invariably extending them beyond the point of all satisfaction or satiation outside the imagination, unquote. This desire-driven act of imagination involves an aspiration toward the infinite, quote, that returns to the self in the form of a psychological movement to constitute, i.e. through imagination, oneself, or through the collective imagining of opinion, the collective self to which one belongs as a unifying origin. And this origin is a preeminent source of meaning and value in relation to which all extrinsic limits or perspective limits become a sign of contradiction and often a constrictive finitude. Marion's keen interest from the beginning in desire and the self suggests a relationship to this tradition. Perhaps further insights will arrive if we ask how Marion's account of the fundamentally erotic nature of resistance to the given fits into his history of philosophy, which contains within it a component of cultural critique through his consistent and increasing evocation of the problem of nihilism. Thank you.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias, Steven, por tu magnífica conferencia de apertura. Contamos con un breve tiempo para alguna pregunta que quiera hacer el público. Matías, adelante. Sí, a ver.
Thank you very much, Stephen, for your great conference. I have a question concerning the interpretation, Jean-Luc Marion interpretation of Hölderlin. It's very interesting that this idea of Bildsamkeit has okay. And another thing, and this idea of Schönheit, is beautiness, beauty, I don't know how to translate, because Hölderlin says that this idea of Bildsamkeit, this image, these limits between God and human in poetry, depends on the Schönheit, the beautiness. And that's very interesting because this idea comes from his stay in Tübingen, where Hölderlin reads Phaedon, Phaedro, yeah, and a lot of dialogues of Plato. It's an inspiration of his Platonic tradition, who comes from Marsilio Ficino, the translation of Marsilio Ficino, yeah. There's a Platonic translation in 19th century and 18th century. And I think that's the same problem, because if Hölderlin inspires in this Platonic tradition of Schönheit, there's the same problem in Marion, because imagination is something in medieval philosophy to make an image of something that is not in sensation, image of something who was in sensation. But this idea of Schönheit, on beautiness, comes from this Platonic tradition, that something that you cannot create, that comes before you. The Schönheit comes before you. And that's the same problem with Marion, this idea of image, that he cannot accept the image as a modern philosopher, because that implies active subjectivity. But he also has to talk about Bildsamkeit, like Hölderlin. You think Hölderlin and Marion, they have the same problem because they want to talk about image, but they accept that there is another phenomenalization of image who comes before subjectivity. Yeah. I think that's a double inspiration become from a double problem, you know, or influence.
Yeah, so there's a part in the essay on Marion's essay where he interprets basically every line in the entire poem, so just about. So there's nothing that isn't commented on in some way. And that moment where beauty is mentioned in the poem, if I'm remembering correctly, because I there's so many things I couldn't try to cover in that essay, but he talks about the relationship of the artist of his art to nature, and he says that it's a man. The suggestion is that man has a mission, in a sense, to contribute to nature and allow nature to realize itself in a way that it can't by itself without human activity. And that's the context in which the word beauty that arises in the poem is connected with. Now, more than that, I would have to go back and look at that passage more. But that's very. I mean, the other thing is, I don't really know very much about Hölderlin independently. I started trying to learn more. It's obviously a huge topic, but that's very helpful because that's certainly a useful set of questions to bring to this whole thing, because the question of the extent to which Marion's interpretation is a good one is a good question.
Gracias, Matías. ¿Alguien más acá en la sala que tenga alguna pregunta? Ok, Ezequiel.
Thank you very much for the excellent conference. It's a topic that it's not, I think that it's not very work in Marion, the imagination. I want to ask you if we can think a non-metaphysical imagination, because it looks like the only possibility is imagination that works a priori. And we can think an imagination not metaphysical in the sense of an imagination that doesn't impose itself on the phenomenon a priori, but rather, on the contrary, an imagination that works with the phenomenon after the decision of receive it. No? In this way, it will be an imagination at the service of the phenomenon. And I think in the icon, no? An image that works for the distance. And we can think in some way iconic imagination in that way.
Perdón, antes de que conteste, ¿todos entienden lo que dijo Ezequiel? ¿Todos entienden inglés? ¿Necesita alguien que haga algún tipo de traducción? Bueno, ok.
Okay, that you're done. Did you have more you wanted to say?
No,
Oh.
got it.
Yeah, so the section of the paper that dealt with Omeno's article, I think, because he says the guiding thread of imagination when approached phenomenologically is how objects are given. It fits exactly with what you're talking about. Now, how he doesn't in that paper, at least, he doesn't bring up, icons and idols and what, the notion of an icon. So that's a good question. I mean, the whole idea within iconography of the icon not made by human hands, that idea, like the first icons not having been painted, but actually being like Veronica's veil or these different Mandilions. I don't know that. I mean, that's an interesting question. That's an idea within that tradition, and how that would fit with an iconic use of the imagination. I'm not sure. Stephanie Rumpsa has a really good, which I mentioned to you in the car today, has a really good book on the phenomenology of icons, and she addresses this this phenomenon within, or this type of icon within iconography, and ways of thinking about it. And Marion brings up this idea of an image that's not made by the artist in the Courbet book even. So I don't know. I don't know if he would. It's a good idea. I don't know if he would accept that though.
I don't know. I don't know. So, yes, I don't know.
Well, gracias. Buena la pregunta. Bueno, ¿hay alguien más? Jeff, do you want to?
Thank you. Thank you, Stephen. It was very illuminating. And I think one thing that made clear to me, and I think this is a subtext, maybe a third conclusion of your paper, is, and it's, I guess you say as much, Marion really privileges the painting as the exemplary phenomenon. It's the first one he talks about when he talks about, the phenomenology of givenness and being given. The first one is that painting that's on the wall of his dining room there, not the poem, which would be Heidegger's, I think privileged access to what he's trying to access. I wonder if but at the end of the paper, you spend a lot of time dealing with Marion's exegesis of poetry. I wonder if you have a sense of, I think you talked about why that is, and maybe what Marion gets when he's describing paintings versus when he's exegeting, explaining poems. And listening to you talk, the thing that struck me, and I don't know if this is consistent throughout his work, is that when he talks about poetry, he's talking about phenomenology, I guess. And when he talks about paintings, he's often doing phenomenology. I don't know if that's a simple distinction, but I don't know. I wonder if you thought that held.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. It's something that I've been thinking about, and I haven't really come to a conclusion yet. Also within painting, I mean, within his discussions of painting, like, is there a significant difference between talking about the more the post-World War II more abstract painters, and then Cezanne and earlier, where there's still some representation going on, and so the core, like, someone was bringing this up to me that maybe there's a significant difference, not necessarily in what he says, but maybe there should be a significant.
Well, I think when he talks about the painting, he's talking about what's given to sensibility, and his discussion of the poem, he rarely talks about the sensation of reading or listening to poetry. It's often that the poem is I think what you're talking about with the imagination here is it's conceptual, it's access to meanings as opposed to sensibility.
Yeah, I think you're right. And more recently he's written some longer, similar length, I guess you could say, papers about Claudel and also about Mallarmé. And from the point of view of someone who reads a lot of literary criticism, they're not very fun to read because they're very word by word but they're very much like what you're saying. Yeah, they're looking at the poem as doing phenomenology as opposed to phenomena being presented. I think you're right about that. So, but it is curious that going back to the idle and distance, the privileged work of art in that book, well, I mean, obviously idols and icons that, you know, are images, but that there's so much time spent on this poem.
Bueno, muchas gracias. No tenemos más tiempo para seguir con las preguntas. Hay una pregunta interesante, Francisco. Gracias por tu pregunta. Simplemente te comento algo y lo charlaremos y te mandaré también la opinión de Steven. Pero Marion critica el arte conceptual. Marion cree que el arte conceptual no es arte, justamente por estos problemas que explicó Steven, ¿no? Porque opera un concepto previo, lo cual, a mi modo de ver, es una mala interpretación del arte conceptual que hace del concepto algo distinto, ¿no? Pero bueno, lo charlaremos y te mandamos ahí algún comentario de Steven. Tenemos que dejar acá. Lo que me gustaría decir, que es una linda noticia para todos y todas, es que Jean-Luc Marion respondió a mi mail y nos mandó unas palabras este, para agradecer y para que las voy a leer ahora muy rápidamente. Y mandó un texto, ahora lo charlamos, porque mandó, Marion has sent me a text, a very long text, which is an introduction for his forthcoming book, which will be a compilation of some of his works, but with this introduction. And he says that there we can find something about distance. So maybe I can send to you the text, because I don't know if we will have the time to read the text in the conference, but maybe we can discuss it on the last day, the main ideas or something like that. Well, I just want to read very quickly the message he sent us by email. And I will read it in French. Is it okay? Cher ami, ou plutôt chers amis, car je suis touché de voir votre colloque annuel perdurer avec des contributeurs de très haute compétence et qui sont presque tous déjà anciens amitiés. Je le salue tout très cordialement. En fait, je travaille en ces moments un peu avec vous et comme vous, non plus directement sur la distance, comme je l'avais fait lors de la republication de certains de mes livres dans bouquin sous le titre Parcours de la distance, avec une introduction autrement dit, autrement vu, mais par une introduction intitulée Repères rétrospectives. Cette fois, pour la réédition en un seul volume de réduction et donation, étant donné des surcroît reprise du donné et figure de la phénoménologie. Apparaître dans la nouvelle collection Grand Classique de presse universitaire de France et en octobre prochain. À tout hasard, je vous envoie ces textes qui peut-être vous seraient utiles. Considérez-les comme ma lointaine contribution à vos travaux. Tenez-moi au courant et soyez assurés de ma fidélité et très cordiale amitié. Jean-Luc Marion. Y ahora les propongo que hagamos un brindis de inauguración de las jornadas y tenemos un ratito más para conversar entonces.